Hi there. Welcome to the Interview Show podcast. My name is Mark Bazer, and on this episode, we have my interview with Samantha Harvey. It was from March 20th at FitzGerald's. Samantha is a novelist whose latest book is Orbital, which won the Booker Prize. The book, which takes place on the International Space Station, has just an unfair number of passages to revisit. For such a slender book, here's one I really liked. Quote, "Maybe human civilization is like a single life. We grow out of the royalty of childhood into supreme normality. We find out about our own unspecialness, and in a flush of innocence, we feel quite glad. If we're not special, we might not be alone. If there are who knows how many planets, one of those planets is surely inhabited, and companionship is our consolation for being trivial." The book may take place in space, but Orbital is very much about the Earth. In many ways, it's a warning, but I think it's also a celebration of the planet. I very much recommend it. Samantha is the author of several other works of fiction, as well as a memoir. I had a great time talking to her. Again, the show is at FitzGerald's, which is in Berwyn, right outside Chicago. We hope to be back there soon. But next up, we're at the Hideout in Chicago on May 30th. You can find out more at theinterviewshowchicago.com. And if you like this podcast, please share it, like it, do all those things. The audio is a little sketchy. We're recording in a live room and did our best. But now I think you'll enjoy our conversation with Samantha Harvey.
How are you? Thank you. Come on in. Yikes. How are you?
A little bit drunk.
Well, do you want another beer? We could.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming. You came all the way from Bath, England, right?
Well, today I came all the way from New York, but yeah.
Well, fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah.
So I want to start with the idea of the book is it's called Orbital, and it takes place on a single day. I had no idea that this was even true, which just shows how ignorant I am, that the International Space Station orbits around the Earth 16 times a day, and so it covers that and the 6 astronauts from different countries who are aboard, and that's what happens. But what I think
Yeah, it is.
is that true? That's true,
Yeah,
right? That's accurate.
everything that
What if I got that wrong? But what struck me, and I think it struck other people as well, is that it's a novel in space, and there is some gazing out, but most of it is gazing back. So talk about that, just starting with a novel in space in which you're actually observing and gazing the Earth.
Yeah. Well, I mean, thank you firstly so much for being here and coming to listen to me speak. This is definitely the most rock star thing I've ever done. So yeah, you're right. I mean, what I wanted to do with this book was look back at the Earth. That was kind of the point of it, and I wanted to try to put into words what I felt when I looked at images of the Earth from space. So this was really a book that was kind of aspiring towards something painterly, something image-led, something that could kind of contemplate the Earth in its fullness. Because I think I am feeling probably even more so now, sort of a bit despairing about humanity. And I found that when I started looking at these images of the Earth from low Earth orbit, so from the space station, I could kind of get to a point where I'd zoomed out far enough that you could see the Earth and it feels intimate and it feels familiar, and you can sort of see the continents and countries, but also I could get to a point at which I wasn't feeling quite so angry and upset about everything, and I could kind of see us as a species that is sort of muddling through and trying to find its way and trying to survive. It gave me a perspective that could contain all of these different feelings, I suppose, of sort of hope and despair and sort of a tenderness for humanity, as well as a frustrated kind of anger at humanity. And so just that short distance of 250 miles was enough for me to be able to take in all of its contradictions and try to write about the extraordinary beauty of this planet.
Well, I'm so glad you teed it off this way, because throughout the book, and I think this is true of other works of yours as well, there seems to be a lot of moments where one thing is true and the opposite can also be true. And is that something that like kind of appeals to you? On the one hand, let's just take a very, very broad example, which is that the Earth, on the one hand, is tiny and insignificant in, obviously, the universe. On the other hand, it's everything to us,
Exactly.
right? And
Yeah.
that's something that you deal with. So talk about using fiction or using this book to make sense of things that are contradictions but are both true.
Yeah, I mean, when you start to sort of, when you zoom out in this way and you start to look at the Earth, and then you also think about life on the International Space Station, you realize that it's all about this kind of series of contradictory things that are true at once, as exactly as you say. So the Earth, when you look at it from that sort of small distance, it feels kind of familiar, feels really like I just think that the continents, because they're moving so fast around the Earth, the continents sort of pass by like a series of gardens. You know, it's almost, it feels, when you get used to looking, you can identify where you are very quickly, and you can sort of, even when you're over an ocean, you can think, oh, this is the Indian Ocean, or this is the Atlantic. They feel very different, the light is different. So you start to see how small the Earth is and how kind of intimate it is. And then also, of course, as you say, it's everything to us. It's huge. It's everything we have. And then life itself on the ISS is kind of both domestic, completely domestic scale. They spend an enormous amount of time vacuuming and dusting. And
It's
packing
mundane.
things.
There's
It's
mundanity.
really mundane. I mean,
Yeah.
their days are kind of mapped out very, to the minute. They don't have very much freedom in what they do. And they do a lot of science there, but most of what they do is kind of housekeeping, really. And kind of they do each other's dentistry and hairdressing and stuff, which is worrying.
And yet,
And yet there they are, whilst they're doing each other's dentistry or vacuuming, looking out of the window, and there goes China, or there goes the Arctic. I think this kind of clash of scale is what really fascinated me about writing this book. That you're dealing with things that are both very mundane and also utterly extraordinary and majestic, and sort of ask you to reevaluate everything. I find that really interesting, that even just going 250 miles above the Earth is enough to sort of make you reevaluate what you think about the Earth.
I want to
what you
go
think about us.
back to something you said at the outset about how you're feeling pretty low about people and humans and welcome to America, but at the same time, you kind of, through this book, got to see people kind of muddling through. I also saw another contradiction, which is right in the text, which is this idea of like, is pursuing the beyond, is doing what, I can't remember which character says it, but is going as far as we can go, which of course is one of the things that happens when you go to space, but it happens in other areas as well. Are we being foolish, or are we being brave? Are we doing what we're supposed to be doing and seeking, or are we actually destroying? And that's also a theme that I think recurs, honestly, throughout the book.
Yeah, that's a good observation, I think. So when I started writing this book, I worried about my capacity to occupy the mindset of an astronaut, because obviously I'm not an astronaut, and I've never been to space, and I will never go.
But you have probably vacuumed. So
Yeah,
yeah, so
exactly.
That's all you need to know. It turns out.
But I'm also, the least intrepid person ever born. I'm really unadventurous. I'm quite cowardly. I'm quite travel sick. I'm never gonna be able to do what they do. And I could feel in myself this sense of, why bother? Why go to space? I kind of understand the project of the space station. That sort of work, the scale of that works for me, and it's a kind of a beautiful experiment in human cooperation in a way, and it's lasted for 25 years, and it is now really the only place in which Russia and the West is still cooperating in a meaningful way. So I sort of get that, and it's orbiting the Earth, and it's a sort of shepherding the Earth and attending to it. That makes sense. But the project of getting back to the moon and getting to Mars seems to me kind of crazy. I don't really understand why we're doing it, and yet I do accept that this is so fundamentally part of what makes us the species we are, that we venture out, we are curious, we always want to reach a new frontier. There's something beautiful in that, and none of us would be sitting here now without people who pioneered and who wanted to make things better and different. So I get that. We would all be in caves if the world were run by me. And we'd be like eating rabbits and then feeling really guilty about it. So I get that that's it's a beautiful part of the human spirit, but I do also think that the way we are venturing into space now is so corporate, and it's so much led by very wealthy individuals whose names don't need to be mentioned, and it's become very politicized now, and it's quite exploitative, it seems to me, and I don't really like the way we are approaching space exploration now. It's not really so much state-driven as corporate and driven by particular vested interests, and it's a kind of land grab. It's whoever gets to the moon first, whoever gets to Mars first can own those resources. We've filled space up with junk. So
how much junk is there in space?
And I can't remember the figure, but it's maybe a couple of million pieces of space junk, and it's exponential because every time those bits of junk crash into each other, they create however many more pieces. So, and even just one kind of fleck of paint is enough to shatter glass on the ISS because of the speed at which they're moving. So it's a huge problem now. So I think that I wanted to use this book as a way of looking back, to come back to your first question, sort of taking a moment before we go beyond Earth and to the moon and to Mars, and to look back at the Earth and to look back at this kind of quite beautiful collaborative project that's been the ISS, and to try to sort of memorialize it and to try to celebrate the joy of the images that it's given us, and the way that it's enabled us to see our own planet and ourselves before we, in my mind, sort of go forward and start venturing into this one last wilderness we have, which is space beyond low Earth orbit, and probably doing it damage.
The book does not set out to be funny. However, you bring up politics, you bring up everybody on this station, two cosmonauts. Why do they call cosmonauts as the same thing as an astronaut, right? It's just a different
They're exactly the
word.
same. I just think they didn't
use the word.
want to use the same word.
Understand.
Exactly.
So two Russians, Italian, American, two Americans, Japanese, and everybody's getting along. They're there because they love what they're doing and they actually love each other. And here's the funny part. The Russians aren't supposed to use the other bathroom that everybody else is using because and you call it is it the political toilet or something? What do you call it? There's
the national
toilet. Yeah, the national toilet.
Yeah.
Which is that real?
Well, it's kind of real. I mean,
you novelists.
Yeah, it's kind of real. There are different toilets on the ISS. So there's the American toilet and the Russian toilet. And you have to undergo different training courses to use each one because they function quite differently.
Really?
So this is true, yeah.
Yeah.
So the Russian part of the spacecraft is quite different to the NASA and ESA and Japanese part. So they do have these distinct areas, like a galley that's Russian and a galley that's American and a toilet that's Russian. Usually they just all use each other's stuff.
But they're not supposed to.
Well, mostly they're supposed to, but there was, and I think they are at the moment. I think they are at the moment, but there was some kind of diplomatic kind of incident between Russia and America several years ago. This was before the war in Ukraine, and but still there was some kind of disagreement, and the Russians said to the Americans, "Well, your astronauts can't use our toilet then." And the Americans said, "Well, in that case, your cosmonauts can't use our toilet then. And anyway, our toilet's better than your toilet." So this really happened.
That says it all.
Yeah, it says everything. But of course, the astronauts and the cosmonauts are not going to care. They're not going to do that.
If you gotta go, you gotta go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Takes a while to float into the other segment of the craft. And anyhow, it's preposterous because there they are. There's usually 6 of them. There's always Americans. There are always Russians, and their lives are totally interdependent. And they drink one another's recycled urine. So they're not.
That is true. That is true. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it turns into water.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
One of the, it's not even a criticism, one of the comments that comes up again and again in reviews of the book, and it's certainly true, is that the characters, there's 6 of them, exist somewhat, it's not a typical novel in that, and these characters are doing this and that propels the action. The characters sit somewhere, I don't know if it's on the periphery, but they're not, it's not a typical novel in that sense. And yet, what I get from them, each of them, is that they each have a story. And back home, they each have a story. And that, to me, is, in this sense, kind of enough. How do you view the role of, I don't want to say plot, but characters and what they do and what they talk about in terms of the overall whole of the book?
It's really interesting because I always, with my previous novels, and so with The Western Wind, for example, they're all about character, and they're all about exploring the inner life of one character and the outer life of that character. And that's what I love doing as a novelist, I think. And with this novel, I realized it had to be something different, that I didn't want the novel to work only at a human scale. I wanted there to be humans in there, but it's not all about them. It is partly about them, but it's not all about them. And the narrative scale of the book goes way beyond them. So I wanted to kind of give them some context and some backstory and to make them human. But I didn't want to get beyond what happens to them on this one day in space. And because it's just one day, and because I was thinking, right, well, you've got these 6 people who are doing the thing they love to do. Everything I've learned about astronauts is that there's nothing they want more than to be in space, and they're never happier than when they're actually in space. So you've got these 6 people who are living their dream, and it's taking place over one day, and the last thing an astronaut wants when they're in space is plot of any kind. So I don't want there to be plot. I don't want anything bad to happen to them. I want this to be a novel that's about rapture, that's about beauty, that's about people having a good day in which nothing goes wrong and there's no conflict, and I'm not relying on conflict for drama, which is, usually conflict is the biggest driver of plot in novels and films and so on. And I didn't want to go down that route. I thought I don't want them to have any conflict. I want them to all be having this kind of euphoric day in space, and that's somehow I've got to create a sense of propulsion in the novel and a sense of kind of spellbinding and momentum through other means, not through us caring deeply about the characters and not through plot or conflict. So it was quite an interesting project.
Yeah, that's a challenge.
It was a real challenge.
Yeah, I mean, you pulled it off, but
Thank you.
not
Well,
everybody
I
can
mean,
pull
not in
that off.
everyone's
Like, I'm going to make
mind.
a novel without plot or conflict
Yeah.
and win the Booker. That's what I'm going to do. And you did it. Have you heard from anybody, any astronaut that's been on the space station that says, yeah, you nailed it? Or, well, we don't vacuum that much. Or,
Yeah, I have. I've had the astronaut Katie Coleman, who's a NASA astronaut. She was on the ISS for 6 months. She got in touch with me, which was lovely, and we've done a few interviews together. She's really, really lovely, and she's kind of brilliantly, brutally honest as well. So she said to me, I read your book and I thought that there were so many times when you articulated something about being in space that I had either forgotten or I'd never been able to articulate for myself, and it was just kind of joyous to have someone put into words an experience that felt beyond words. And so for me, that was the highest form of praise. And then she said, and there were other sections where I just wrote in the margin, no.
That's amazing. But very high praise to begin with.
Amazingly high.
Can we talk just for a second? The International Space Station is kind of incredible. Like, it's going around right now. Now we're thinking about it, but nobody's normally thinking about it. You mentioned something that is really kind of unintentionally cool about it, which is that because it was built, it went up in 98, astronauts got there in 2000, like the styles feel now retro, the technology in some senses is retro. It's coming down in 2030, and it's going 17,000 miles an hour. Like all of these things, and it's only 250 miles away, which is the only thing about it that doesn't seem, space numbers are always crazy. You're like, how is that even possible?
Yeah.
And it is kind of a human miracle.
It really is. It is an incredible machine. And I love the fact that it is a bit vintage now, and it's a bit rattly, and some of the old Russian segments look a bit kind of post-Soviet and a bit
It's so weird.
weird.
It's like the Millennium Falcon at this point.
Exactly. It really is.
Yeah.
It is. And it's this kind of like rattling kind of time capsule in a way. And it has a shelf life. It was always going to be deorbited somewhere around 2030 because it's going so fast and it's being pelted by space junk and it can't last. But it is just a really astonishing piece of human ingenuity, but also, again, of human goodwill, I think. It has 17 contributing nations, and it's kind of a beautiful thing. And we are largely unaware of it. I mean, we've been made aware of it lately because of the astronauts who've been stuck there. But even
Who said they weren't really stuck? Who said, like you said, that they said, we like being there?
I mean, everything I know about astronauts and speaking to some and reading their books is that they are never happier than when they're in space. So everyone was sort of, worried about these two astronauts stuck on the ISS. But actually, when I spoke to Katie Coleman, she said, they just couldn't be happier to have a bonus 9-month mission on the space station. It's just something every astronaut would dream of. And I said to Katie, would you go back now? And she was like, of course I'd go back. Every astronaut would go back. So I think
that's what they train for.
That's what they live for.
Yeah. And in fact, each of the characters are all different, but one thing that they all share is that from childhood they were taken with space. Were you taken with space as a child?
No, not really.
Yeah.
Not really.
Did you work at a space museum at one point?
I did. I worked at an astronomy museum, yeah. But that's not really where the book came from. I have always had a sort of passing interest in space, but it's been an interest in what astronauts say about the Earth after they've been in space. That's always, the Earth has always been my interest. And the vantage point of space has been kind of fascinating to me. So when I was like a geeky teenager, I used to collect quotes from astronauts after they'd been in space, and it was things that they would say about what they'd seen and how they felt and how it had changed them, and they all say kind of the same thing, year after year, decade after decade. It's the same sort of thing. This urgent desire and demand to protect our planet, and I think that message just couldn't be any more timely, and yet still, it doesn't seem to be heard.
I mean, one question that I kept coming back to as I read the book was, is the example that these 6 characters are setting and living in harmony one that could be replicated on Earth, or could it only happen because they are where they are doing what they're doing?
It's a really good question. I think that maybe it can't be replicated large scale on Earth. I think there's something about expediency, about the need to coexist peacefully as they do on the ISS. It doesn't matter, even if your nations are at war, you have to man this spacecraft together, and you have to coexist because your survival depends
Common
upon
goal,
it.
common interest.
Exactly. That's easy with 6 people. It's somewhat more difficult with a multi-billion global population. I do think, though, that of course we can look at humanity now, and we can look at the Earth now and think we're in a mess, and we are. But I think by and large, that model of sort of local cooperation that you see on the ISS does kind of exist here.
Yeah, for sure.
And we are really quite a remarkable species in our ability to coexist with one another and to be largely kind to one another, or at least not to harm one another, at a fairly small local scale. And I think that's something that sort of surprised me in writing this book was some of my anger with the human race sort of transformed into a tenderness and a sense of we're sort of doing our best, and it's often not good enough. But there is a lot there that you can see replicated on the space station, of cooperation, of a desire for peace, a desire to get along, and that is largely true, I think, in our lives.
That comes through loud and clear in the book. You've been living with this book for a while. You've been doing these kind of talks. Has it changed for you? Has the book changed for you? Like, do you feel differently about it? Has some reader come up to you and said something that made you think differently? Or you can just say no.
It's interesting. A lot of people have spoken to me about, so there's one character in the book called Chie. She's a Japanese astronaut, and her mother dies while she's in orbit, so she can't go back to the funeral, and she obviously didn't get to see her one last time before she died. And a lot of people have picked up on that. I mean, I suppose it's a character point. There aren't that many in the book, but a lot of people have picked up on that, on the loss of mothers or the loss of parents, grief, and maybe it sort of replicates a feeling of the COVID lockdowns and how we couldn't say goodbye to one another in that time. So there's that. I think also, my relationship with the book is quite interesting now, because when I wrote it and when it was published, I thought, well, that's just another sort of strange book that I've written. In a way, it's one of the strangest books I've written, and it's quite unconventional, and it is plotless, as we've discussed, and it's a bit niche, and that will probably have about 3,000 readers at the most, and that will be that. And I'll get some nice reviews, and I'll get a few bad reviews, and that will be that. And in a way, I'm quite comfortable with that. That's been my experience with my other books, so I'm quite comfortable with it. And the fact that it has done so extraordinarily well has sort of thrown me a bit. And I think I need to go back and read it again and re-establish my relationship with it.
It's pretty good.
What does everyone see?
Well, I mean, I can just speak to what I responded to, in that we're at such obviously a delicate time, and to have a book that confronts that, but at the same time, it's kind of also celebrates what's worth confronting.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
and-
more than cool, and that's not what I'd write if I actually reviewed it. But that's what I
I'd take
felt.
that. Yeah, and it really is, above all, a book that is about beauty and wonder and rapture, and that's what I wanted to write about. I thought when I started writing it, I have this feeling in me when I look at those images of the Earth from space that is kind of like being in love. That's it. That's the nearest analogy I have for it. And I want to write about that. And I don't think we write enough about beauty and rapture and this expanded feeling of being in love. We don't really, and even if we do, then it all has to go wrong somehow. But what if it didn't go wrong? What if it was just kind of this one expanded, rapturous moment, and we could just live with that for a while? And that's what I wanted to do, above all else. And I know there are so many themes in the book, and there are pessimistic things about it, and it is a kind of warning, but above that, it's really just about this expanded feeling of joy at what we have.
I love that. Thank you for coming by. Samantha Harvey, everyone. Thank you so much. Is that all right?
That again was Samantha Harvey. Thanks to Samantha for spending time with us on the show. Thanks to everyone who came out. Thanks also to Chicago Humanities, who were our partner on the show. You can find out more about what they do at chicagohumanities.org. And thanks to everyone at FitzGerald's who treat us so well. You can find out more at their site, which must be, just look FitzGerald's up in Google, you'll get there. FitzGerald's in Berwyn, which is right outside Chicago. But our next show is at the Hideout again. That's on May 30th. And you can find more information at my site, the interview show, chicago.com. Our guests are going to be Austan Goolsbee, who runs the Chicago Fed, Sarah Spain, who is a longtime sports columnist, commentator. She's got a podcast on iHeartRadio, and she's got a new book coming out, which will be out in time for the show. And then the band Moontype, who has their second album coming out, which will also be out just in time for the show. So that's May 30th. Thank you all. Thanks for listening. And if you like it, please share.